It's Passover week, the city's packed, and 4 days ago Herod Agrippa took James, John's brother, one of the 3 men who went up the mountain and saw Jesus shining, and he killed him with a sword. No trial worth the name. And when he saw how much the crowd liked it, he went and arrested Peter too, and put 4 squads of soldiers on him, 16 men, for 1 fisherman. Peter's sleeping between 2 of them, with a chain running from his wrist to each of theirs, because Herod is not going to lose this one. And across town, in a house belonging to a woman named Mary, the church is up all night praying, doors locked, lamps low, voices down. Because if the soldiers who took Peter come looking for the people who follow Peter, this is the address. And somebody starts knocking. Now watch who goes to the door. Not Mary, who owns the house, not one of the men, a servant girl. Her name is Rhoda, which means rose, which is the kind of name people gave slaves in that world. Flower names, jewel names, the names you'd give a nice thing you owned. And she gets up and goes out through the courtyard toward the outer gate. I need you to understand what that job actually was. In a house like that, the gate is set into a wall, and the wall opens into a courtyard, and the house is inside the courtyard. The person who goes to the gate at night in a week when the government is killing Christians is not doing a chore. She is the buffer. She is the first face the soldiers see. If it's Herod's men out there, she's the one who gets grabbed. The church put a teenage slave girl between itself and the sword, and she went. And she gets to the gate, and before she opens it, she listens, and she knows the voice. She knows Peter's voice. Think about that for a second. She's been in the room while he taught. She's carried the bread in and taken the cups out and refilled the oil in the lamps while the men talked, and nobody ever once turned around and asked her what she thought. She was furniture, and she knew his voice through a door in the dark. And what she does next is the most human thing in the whole Bible. She's so happy she forgets to open the gate. She leaves him standing in the street, and she runs, the text says she ran, back through the courtyard into the room full of praying people and says, Peter is standing at the gate. And they say, thou art mad. You have to sit in that. These people have been praying all night. Luke says the church was praying without ceasing. They asked God for one thing, get him out. And when the answer showed up and knocked on the door, they told the girl she'd lost her mind. And she keeps at it. Luke uses a word there that means she stood her ground, she kept insisting. She would not back off it. And so they come up with a theory. They say, it is his angel, which is a nice way of saying he's dead. Something of him is out there, but not him. They'd rather believe in a ghost than believe God did the thing they'd been on their knees asking for since sundown. And here's why they didn't believe her. In that world, a slave's word was worth nothing. In a Roman court, a slave's testimony couldn't even be entered unless it was taken under torture. That's how little it counted. Her word alone was worth exactly 0. Everyone in that room had spent their whole lives learning that people like Rhoda don't bring you the truth. And the entire time they're arguing about it, this is the part that kills me. Peter's still out there, knocking. Luke says he continued knocking. The apostle just walked out of a prison past 2 guards and an iron gate that opened by itself, and he cannot get into a prayer meeting. They finally open it, and they see him, and Luke says they were astonished. Of course they were. So let me ask you something before we leave this street. What if the answer you've been praying for is already at the gate, not on the way, not coming someday? At the gate, and the reason you haven't received it is that it didn't come the way you expected, or it came through a person you'd already decided doesn't count. Because God did not send the news of that miracle to Mary, who had the house. He didn't send it to the elders. He gave it to a girl whose testimony wasn't admissible anywhere in the empire. And that's twice now, because the first people to know about the empty tomb were women, in a culture where a woman's word in court was worth about as much as Rhoda's. God has a pattern. He keeps handing the biggest news in the world to the people nobody would believe. Somebody in your life is knocking. Go open the gate. Now let me take you about 800 miles west and about 15 years later into a rented room in Rome, where a man is dying and nobody back home knows. His name is Epaphroditus, and let's start with the name, because the name is a scandal. Epaphroditus means belonging to Aphrodite. He's named after the goddess of sex. That's his birth name, a Gentile boy from Philippi, a Roman colony full of retired soldiers, named for a fertility goddess, in a family that would have had a little shrine in the house and burned something on it every morning. And the church at Philippi, the church that started with a businesswoman and a demon-possessed slave girl and a jailer who tried to kill himself, took an offering. Paul's in prison in Rome. He's got no income. In a Roman prison, you ate what your friends carried in to you. And if nobody came, you got thin, and then you got sick, and then you were done. So they raised money, and now somebody has to carry it. 800 miles. Overland, on the Via Egnatia, across Macedonia to the coast, then a boat across to Italy, then up the Appian Way to Rome. 6 weeks if everything goes right, 2 months if it doesn't, bandits on the roads, and you're carrying cash for a man in a cell. They picked Venus Boy, and somewhere in it he got sick. Paul says he was sick nigh unto death, right up against it. And listen to what Paul says next, because this is the sentence I want carved somewhere. He was full of heaviness, Paul says, because he had heard that he had been sick and read it again. He almost died. And what tore him up wasn't the dying. It was that word got back to Philippi that he was sick, and he couldn't stand the thought of them worrying about him. He was on his deathbed, homesick, and his one grief was that he was inconveniencing people. Some of you are that person. You've spent your whole life being the one who carries things for everybody else and apologizing for taking up space while you do it. Now, Paul writes one line about him that changed church history. He says Epaphroditus came near to death, not regarding his life. And the Greek word underneath not regarding is a gambling word. It's the word for throwing the dice, for putting everything on the table and letting go of it. Paul reached for the language of a back-alley game of chance to describe a man carrying an offering. He gambled his life. He rolled it. And 200 years later, when the plague came through Carthage and the bodies were in the streets and everybody with money and sense was outside the city walls, there were Christians who went into those houses and nursed the dying and carried out the dead and buried them with their own hands. And a lot of them caught it and died. And the name history gave those men came straight out of this verse. They were called the Parabolani, the gamblers. The ambulance corps of the early church got its name from one homesick man who nearly died carrying somebody else's money. And here's how the story ends, and it's not the way you'd write it. He doesn't recover and go plant a church. He doesn't get a chapter in Acts. Paul sends him home, early, with a letter. Because Paul knows exactly what's waiting for him. He knows a man is going to walk back into that church having spent 2 months and nearly his life with nothing to show for it, and some people are going to look at him a certain way. So Paul writes ahead, and he says, receive him with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. Hold men like this precious. Paul had to tell a church to honor him. And then he stacks up the titles. My brother, my companion in labor, my fellow soldier, your messenger, he that ministered to my wants. 5 names for one man who did nothing you could put on a poster. If you have spent 30 years carrying things for other people, and you've got no story to tell for it, no crowd, no platform, nobody who knows what it cost, I want you to hear Paul from a Roman cell. Hold such in reputation. Heaven has a different scoreboard than the one you've been reading. I'll say this here because it belongs here. Everything we just did with that one word, that's the whole reason our store exists. The ebook study guides, the explainer videos, the full video lessons where we stay with one subject across several teachings instead of cramming it into 40 minutes. They're all built to do what we just did, slower and further, until the page starts talking to you at your own kitchen table. It's all in the description. Now let's stay in Rome, because I want to show you a man who went looking for Paul. Same city. Later, much worse. This is the second imprisonment. The fire has already happened. Rome burned in the year 64, and Nero needed somebody to blame, and he picked the Christians. The Roman historian Tacitus, who had no love for Christians at all, wrote down what happened next, and I'm not going to describe all of it. But he says they were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. He says some of them were fixed up in Nero's gardens and set on fire to light the paths at night. And that's the city. That's the year. And Paul isn't in a rented house anymore with a soldier on his wrist. He's in a hole. He's cold. He writes to Timothy and asks him to bring his coat before winter, which is one of the saddest sentences in the New Testament, an old man asking somebody to bring him a coat. He says everybody in Asia has turned away from him. He names them. And then he says this, "The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chain." Onesiphorus. Say it out loud once, because almost nobody ever does. He oft refreshed me. The word is a cooling word, the way you'd talk about water on a fever, air in a shut room. He came again and again. Prison food was whatever your friends carried in, so somebody was carrying food down into that hole, over and over. But that's not the line. Here's the line. Paul says, "When he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently and found me." He searched. Rome was 1,000,000 people. There was no address. There was no list. Paul was a nobody, one condemned Jew in a city that was executing Jews who followed a crucified one, and if you wanted to find him, you had to go and ask. You had to walk up to Roman soldiers in the year when Christians were being used as garden torches and say, "I'm looking for a man. He's a prisoner. He's one of those Christians. Which way?" Every single time he opened his mouth to ask, he was one wrong guard away from the arena. And he kept asking, door after door, prison after prison, guard after guard, until he found him, and was not ashamed of my chain. Paul uses that word 3 times in that one chapter. He tells Timothy, "Be not thou ashamed." He says about himself, "I am not ashamed." And then he says about this man, he was not ashamed of my chain. You can feel Paul circling it. He's an old man taking inventory of who stayed, and the whole ledger comes down to one question. Who was ashamed of me? Now here's the part that makes my throat close. Paul greets the house of Onesiphorus twice, once here, once at the end of the letter. He greets the household, but he never greets the man. And then he prays this, "The Lord grant unto him that he may find mercy of the Lord in that day." In that day, not this one. A lot of people who've spent their lives in this text think Onesiphorus was already dead by the time Paul wrote this, that the searching cost him, that he found Paul and then somebody found him. And look at what Paul prays, that he may find mercy. Same verb. He found me. Lord, let him find mercy. He went looking for a prisoner in the dark and found him. Paul's last prayer for his friend is, "God, on the last day let him go looking and find you." So let me ask you plainly, who are you ashamed of? Who's in your life right now that you love in private and don't claim in public because of what they did or where they've ended up or what people would say if they knew you still took their calls? Somebody's in a hole. And the whole New Testament remembers the name of one man who went and asked around until he found him. Now come south with me, out of the city, out onto a desert road, going down from Jerusalem toward Gaza, because there's a chariot on that road and a man in it, and he's reading out loud. And this is one of the most devastating scenes in the Bible, and almost nobody sees why. He's Ethiopian, which in that world meant Nubia, the kingdom of Meroe, down past the cataracts of the Nile in what's now Sudan. He works for the Kandake. That's not a woman's name, by the way. It's a title like Pharaoh or Caesar, the queen mother of that kingdom. He's her treasurer. He runs the money of a nation. And he's a eunuch, which is why he has the job. Men were cut to make them safe around royal women and safe with royal money, and the cutting was done to boys, and it was done to them by other people. And nobody ever asked them. Now, He has just traveled something like 1,500 miles to worship in Jerusalem. Count that again. 1,500 miles, by chariot and by boat and on foot, months, each way. And Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 1 says that a man who is cut like he was cut shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. He knew that. A man who owns a scroll of Isaiah knows what's in the law. So he went 1,500 miles to a temple that would let him stand in one outer court and no closer. He stood at the edge of the thing he came for. He looked at a building he was legally forbidden to walk into, and then he got back in the chariot. And here's what makes me want to put my head down on the desk. He's going home, and he's still reading. He had every reason to burn that scroll on the way out of town. Every reason to say, I have crossed a desert for a God whose own book says I'm not welcome. I'm done. Instead, he's bouncing along a road in the heat with a scroll open on his knees, reading it out loud, still trying. And you need to know what a scroll cost. This wasn't a paperback. Isaiah was hand-copied, letter by letter, onto skins by a professional. A scroll like that could cost a working man close to a year's wages. He probably bought it in Jerusalem. He walked out of the one city on earth that had the book, carrying the book he was excluded from, and he kept reading it. And Philip runs up alongside the chariot and hears what he's reading. Isaiah 53. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. And who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. Who shall declare his generation? Stop! Do you hear what he's reading? He is a man with no generation. He will have no children. No son will carry his name. When he dies, the line stops, and there won't be anybody at the grave who has his eyes. In that world, that was the definition of a wasted life. Your name lived in your children and nowhere else. He is a dead branch, and everybody who looks at him knows it. And he is sitting in a chariot in the desert, reading about a man whose life was taken from the earth, and who had no generation either. And he says to Philip, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself, or of some other man? That is not a Bible study question. That's not academic. That is a man saying, is there anybody else in this book like me? Is there one page in here where somebody's cut off like I'm cut off? And now I have to show you something, and I want you to feel the floor move. The scroll on his lap. If he had unrolled it, 3 more columns. 3. Isaiah chapter 56, verses 3 through 5. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. The only promise in the entire Old Testament written directly to men like him, naming his exact grief, I am a dry tree, answering it, a name better than sons and daughters, and then the word, an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. For a man who was cut off, it was 3 columns away. He was holding it, his hands were on it. And Luke says Philip began at the same scripture and preached unto him Jesus. And they come to some water. And the man says a sentence that you cannot read right unless you've been carrying his life. See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? What hinders me? What forbids me? He's used to being forbidden. He's spent his whole life at the edge of rooms. He's asking very quietly, does it happen again? Is this one more door? And nothing hinders him. He stops the chariot in the middle of the desert, and a man who was never allowed to walk into the house of God walks all the way down into the water and all the way under. And Philip's gone. And Luke says he went on his way rejoicing. The man who came 1,500 miles and got nothing on the way there and got everything on the way home. He never saw Philip again. He rode south with an everlasting name. And the church in Ethiopia has been there ever since. He had no children. He's got a spiritual family of tens of millions, a name better than sons and daughters. God does not exaggerate. 3 columns. That's all that was between him and the promise written for him. And that's exactly what we're trying to fix. The fact that most of us are 3 columns away from the thing God wrote down for us, and nobody ever showed us how to unroll it. That's what the e-books are for. That's what the video lessons in our store are for, where we take one book, one thread, and follow it all the way through instead of stopping when the clock runs out. Not to make you a scholar, to get you to Isaiah 56 on your own. It's in the description. Now stay with me, because there's a man on the road to Golgotha I need you to meet. Friday morning, Jerusalem. There's a man coming into the city from the countryside, and his name is Simon, and he's from Cyrene. That's North Africa, Libya, where there was a big Jewish community that had been there for generations. So this man has traveled across the sea and up through the country to be here. Why? Passover. He's come for Passover. This might be the pilgrimage he saved for his whole life. Some Jews in the diaspora waited decades to do this once. You bring your family, you bring your sons. This is the trip you tell your grandchildren about. And he's walking in. Mark says he was passing by, coming out of the country. And he turns a corner into a street he had no reason to be on. At a minute he had no reason to be there. And a Roman soldier looks at him. And the soldier taps him. Mark uses a specific word for what happens next. Compelled. And it's not a general word for pressure. It's a technical term. It's a loan word the Persians brought in for their imperial postal service, and the Romans kept it, and it meant this. A soldier of the empire could seize any civilian at any moment and make him carry a load. No appeal, no conversation. You don't get to say you're busy. You don't get to say you're on your way to the temple. The spear touches your shoulder, and your day belongs to Rome. Now hold this next thing, because it's almost unbearable. That exact word, that same word, is the one Jesus used in the Sermon on the Mount. Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Jesus taught that word, and on the morning he couldn't carry his own cross anymore, a stranger from Africa lived it for him, and they put the crossbeam on him. Not the whole cross. The upright was already standing at the hill. It stayed there. It got reused. He got the crossbar. 100 pounds of rough timber, give or take, on the shoulder. And Jesus has already been scourged, so that beam is wet. Simon walks the rest of that road behind a man he doesn't know, carrying a piece of an execution, with another man's blood soaking into his clothes and running down his neck. And here's what nobody tells you that ruined his Passover. Blood, a corpse, an execution ground. A man in that state was ceremonially unclean, and he was not eating the feast that night. He crossed the sea for 1 week and lost it in 20 minutes because a soldier picked him out of a crowd. He came for the lamb, and he got conscripted into carrying the cross of the lamb, and it cost him the lamb he came for. If it had ended there, it'd be one of the cruelest accidents in the Bible. Watch what Mark writes. He says, Simon, a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why would you say that? Why name the sons? Because Mark is writing to Rome, and you only identify a man by his kids if his kids are people your readers know. Mark is saying, that's Simon, Alexander, and Rufus's dad. You know them. They're in this church. The man who got grabbed on the street raised sons who ended up known by name in the church at the center of the empire. And then you turn to the last chapter of Romans, where Paul is running down a list of people he loves, and he writes, Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. His mother and mine, that's Simon's wife, Paul. A man with a mother somewhere back in Tarsus, a man who lost his family the day he met Jesus on that road, a man who had been beaten and shipwrecked and left for dead, says of this woman, she's my mother too. She fed him. She sat him down at her table and looked at him the way a mother looks at a son. And it meant so much to him that when he wrote to the greatest church in the world, he stopped his list to say it out loud. That's the family. That's what came out of the worst 20 minutes of Simon's life. He didn't volunteer. Nobody asked him. He was going somewhere else for something holy that he'd planned and paid for, and it got taken from him by force in the street. And it turned out that being interrupted was the calling. Some of you have spent years grieving an interruption, the thing that got taken, the plan that got ruined, the road you were on when somebody tapped your shoulder and everything changed and you never got to finish what you started. Simon of Cyrene lost his Passover and got Christ, and his wife ended up mothering the apostle to the Gentiles. You're allowed to grieve what was taken, but don't you dare assume it was an accident. Now let me show you a man who never said a word. His name is Aristarchus, and he's from Thessalonica, and he shows up 5 times in the New Testament, and he is never once quoted. Not a sentence, not a line. Luke never puts a word in his mouth. The first time we see him, he's being dragged. Ephesus, the silversmiths who make shrines for Diana, figure out that this Jesus movement is going to cost them money, and they start a riot, and the city goes up. And the mob grabs 2 of Paul's traveling companions, Gaius and Aristarchus, and hauls them into the theatre. Go look at that theatre, it's still there. It seated something like 24,000 people. And Luke says the mob was in there for 2 hours screaming, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," over and over, and most of them didn't even know why they'd come. 24,000 people, 2 men on the floor, in the middle. And Paul wants to go in and they won't let him, because they know what happens if he does. That's Aristarchus's introduction to the story, not a sermon, not a vision. He's the guy on the floor of the stadium. And then you'd expect him to go home, wouldn't you? He'd earned it. Nobody would have blamed him. Turn to Acts 27. Paul's a prisoner now. Rome. Real chains, real charges, a centurion named Julius, and a ship. And Luke, who's there, writes this. We launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. Now think it through. Prisoners don't get to bring their friends. There's no visitor list on a prison transport. There were only a couple of ways a free man ended up on that boat with a chained man, and the one most historians land on is that a companion would register himself as the prisoner's slave. That's how you stayed. You gave up your standing as a free man and you signed yourself over as property, so they'd let you carry his bag. He chose the chain. And what did he get for it? Read the chapter. He got the storm. He got the Euroclydon, a nor'easter that grabbed the ship and didn't let go for 2 weeks. He got 14 nights with no sun, no stars, throwing the cargo over with his own hands, then the tackle, then eating nothing for days, then the ship breaking apart under him on a sandbar off Malta and swimming for a beach he'd never heard of in a country he never meant to see. He signed up to be somebody's slave and got a shipwreck. And then from Rome, Paul writes to Colossae, and he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. The word Paul uses there isn't the ordinary word for a prisoner. It's a war word. It means a man taken at the point of a spear. Captured. He came into the story dragged into a stadium by a mob. He goes out of it in a cell, of his own free will, and the Bible never tells us what happened to him. No martyrdom account in Scripture. No last words. He walks off the page. I want to say this carefully because I think somebody needs it. There are people watching right now whose entire life is going to be a footnote in somebody else's story. You raised the kids who did the thing. You paid for the education you never got to use. You held the ladder. You drove the car. You made the meals. You sat in the hospital chair. Your name shows up in 3 verses of a story that isn't yours. Aristarchus is in the Bible, forever, and he never said anything. Heaven is not a stage, and God is not impressed by microphones. And that brings me to the last one. And I've been waiting the whole time to tell you about her. Luke chapter 2. Her name is Anna. Her father's name is Phanuel. And Luke tells us her tribe, and this is where you have to pay attention because Luke doesn't waste words. She's of the tribe of Asher. Asher was one of the 10 northern tribes, and in the year 722 before Christ, the Assyrian Empire came down and took the northern kingdom apart, and deported those tribes and scattered them across the empire, and they were gone. That's 700 years before this woman is standing in that temple. 7 centuries. Those tribes are a memory. They're what people mean when they say the lost tribes. And here's a woman who still knows her father's name and still knows her tribe. Somebody kept it. Somebody in an occupied country, generation after generation, in a family that had every reason to forget, sat a child down and said, "This is who we are. Don't lose it." And they did that for 700 years, so that on one particular morning, a woman could walk into a temple, and Luke could write down where she came from. Now her life, she married. She was married 7 years, and then he died. 7 years, that's it, that's the whole thing. She's a young woman, and the door closes, and there are no children mentioned, which in that world meant she had nothing. No husband, no son, no standing, no protection, no income, nobody obligated to feed her. And Luke says she was a widow of about 84 years. Read it either way. She's 84, or she'd been widowed 84 years, and she's over 100. Doesn't matter. Either way, the math is the same. She had 7 years of a life, and then decades of waiting, and what did she do with it? Luke says, she departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. She lived there, in a chamber somewhere in those courts, and she couldn't go into the holy place. She was a woman. She got as far as the court of the women and no further, her whole life, every single day. She never got closer than that court, and she showed up anyway, night and day, fasting, praying. For how long? 50 years, 60. At 3 in the morning in a stone court with an empty stomach at 78 years old. And praying for what? Luke tells us at the end. She spoke of him to all them that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. That's the prayer. That's what she'd been asking for every night for decades. Redeem us. Come. And nothing happened, nothing. Herod's on the throne and he's a monster. Rome's in the fortress overlooking the temple courts, and there's a garrison up there watching her pray. Every year another Passover, every year another nothing. The prophets have been silent for 400 years. She has no sign, no encouragement, no evidence, no reason. 50 years of praying into a room where nobody answers. And then one ordinary morning, no thunder, no angel, no trumpet, a young couple comes through the gate with a baby. And they're poor. You can tell because of what they brought. The law said, bring a lamb. And then it said, in Leviticus 12, if she can't afford a lamb, 2 turtle doves are enough. That's the poverty clause. That's the offering for people who don't have it. And that's what Mary's carrying, 2 birds. Nobody in that court looked twice. Poor couples with birds came through there all day long. And Luke says, and I want you to hear the words, she coming in that instant, that very hour, she walks in at that exact minute. 50 years of showing up, 10,000 mornings of nothing, and she walks into the right room on the right morning at the right minute because she was there, because she'd always been there. You don't catch the one morning unless you show up on the 10,000. And that old woman looks at a poor couple with 2 pigeons, and she sees the redemption of Jerusalem. And she opens her mouth. Luke says she gave thanks, and she spake of him to all them that looked for redemption. She's the first person in Luke's gospel to go tell anybody, not a priest, not a scholar, an old widow from a tribe that had been erased by an empire, standing in a court she wasn't allowed to leave, telling everybody who'd listened that he's here. Now look at what this woman had, on paper. No husband, no children, no tribe. The tribe's gone. No home, no money, no standing, no platform, no results, for decades. And she's in the room, on the morning, holding the answer with her eyes. The Assyrian Empire that deported her people is dust. Herod is dust. Rome is a ruin people take pictures of. And a widow from the tribe of Asher is in the book of God, with her name and her father's name and her tribe. And we're saying it out loud 2,000 years later. Some of you have been praying for one thing for 30 years, the child, the marriage, the healing, the prodigal. And you've decided that because it hasn't come, you weren't heard, or you weren't enough, or God moved on and forgot the address. Anna prayed into silence for half a century and then walked in at the exact hour. Don't you leave the court. Don't you stop showing up. The answer to her prayer weighed about 8 pounds and came through the gate with the offering of a poor family, and everybody else in that courtyard walked right past him. Father, we've walked past so many of your people. Thank you for a slave girl at a gate who knew your servant's voice through a door, and who was right when the whole room said she was mad. Give us her ears, and forgive us for the times you sent us the truth through a person we'd already decided didn't count. Thank you for a man named after a goddess who gambled his life to carry an offering and came home with nothing to show for it. Lord, for every person watching who has carried other people's weight for 30 years with no one to thank them, hold them in reputation. You know their name. You've known it the whole time. Thank you for the man who searched Rome, for the one who wasn't ashamed of a chain when it was dangerous to know that name. God, make us that friend. And where we've been ashamed, where we've loved someone in private and denied them in public, forgive us and send us back to that door. Thank you for a man in a chariot who crossed a desert for a God whose law said he couldn't come in and kept reading anyway. Lord, for everyone who has ever stood at the edge of a room they were sure they didn't belong in, say it again. A name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Let them hear it tonight. Thank you for a father from Africa whose Holy Week was destroyed by a Roman spear, and who ended up under the cross of the Son of God, and whose wife became a mother to an apostle. For every person grieving an interruption, the plan that got taken, the road they never got to finish, would you show them what you were building? Let them stop calling it an accident. Thank you for a man who never said a word, who chose the chain, who got a shipwreck for his trouble and walked off the page without a single line. Lord, for the ones who will never be quoted, let them know that heaven is not a stage, and you are not impressed by microphones, and their name is written where it will not burn. And thank you, Father, for an old woman from a tribe that an empire erased, who prayed into silence for 50 years and was standing in the right room on the right morning. For everyone watching who has been praying into that silence, don't let them leave the court. Don't let them stop showing up. Let them find the way she did, that you were never late, and that you were coming through the gate the whole time, and that the answer might be smaller and poorer and quieter than they ever expected. You see, the ones nobody names, you always have. Do it again tonight in this house with this one who's listening. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. 7 people, almost nobody preaches them, and every one of them was sitting there in a verse you've read past your whole life. That's what we do here, and that's exactly what the Founders Membership is for. Inside we go book by book through the whole Bible, the culture, the language, the century, the people in the margins, the way we just did tonight but without the clock, the video lessons, the e-books, the study guides, all of it in one place, built for people who are done with the highlight reel and want to know what God is actually saying to them. We open the doors for the ones who want to go deeper than anything you'll hear in a 40-minute video. The link is in the description, and we'd count it a privilege to have you in there with us. Until next time, stay rooted in the Word, stay blessed.